You found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. I'm a lonely woman from Toronto and staying in Mont-Tremblant during the off-season. I found a friendly and hidden place to stay. And so began an innocent adventure that turned sinister when I discovered that one of my friends is linked to a series of disappearances that happen every winter in the mountains. My name is Olivia Keane, 32 years old, originally from Toronto, where I'd given up my apartment 6 months ago to embrace the van life I'd been dreaming about for years. My converted sprinter, lovingly named Wanderlust, had been my loyal companion through Ontario, New Brunswick, and now Quebec, where the colorful autumn had given way to the first whispers of winter. I'd been documenting my journey on my small but growing YouTube channel, determined to show that a woman could travel solo and still be safe. Mont-Tremblant during off-season was hauntingly beautiful. The tourist crowds gone, the ski slopes not yet open, and the small village returned to the locals. I'd parked in what seemed like a perfect spot, a lookout point with a stunning view of the mountains, far enough from the main road to avoid detection, but close enough that I could hear distant cars if I listened carefully. The first night was peaceful, just me and my portable heater keeping Wanderlust cozy as I edited footage from my hike earlier that day. It wasn't until my second day that I met Dominic at the local cafe, a tall, bearded man with kind eyes who spoke English with a charming Quebecois accent. "You're brave to be traveling alone," he'd said, sliding into the seat across from me without waiting for an invitation. I'd become used to this kind of attention, locals curious about the woman in the van, but something about Dominic felt different. He wasn't condescending or flirtatious, just genuinely interested in my travels. When he mentioned he worked as a park ranger and knew secret spots that tourists never found, I felt that familiar tingle of adventure calling to me. "There's an old hunting cabin about 20 minutes from where you're parked," he explained, tracing the route on my map with his index finger. "The view of the valley at sunset is worth the hike." By the time I returned to my van that afternoon, Dominic's number was in my phone and plans were set for him to show me the cabin the next day. I remember thinking how this would make perfect content for my channel, Local Secrets of Mont-Tremblant, completely unaware that I was setting myself up for something that no camera could capture. That night, I noticed another van parked further down the lookout point, its windows dark. I thought nothing of it at the time, just another traveler seeking solitude. But I remember waking up around 3 in the morning to the sound of an engine starting, then fading away into the distance. If only I'd paid more attention to that van, or the fact that Dominic seemed to know exactly where I was parked without me telling him. The next morning brought a thin layer of frost across my windshield and an unsettling text from Dominic. "Looking forward to our hike. Don't tell anyone where you're going today." I brushed aside the faint alarm bells ringing in my head, telling myself he was just being dramatic about keeping his secret spots actually secret. I spent the morning preparing, charging my camera batteries, packing extra layers, and making sure my satellite phone was working. The cell reception in these mountains was spotty at best, non-existent at worst. Around noon, I drove Wanderlust down to the meeting point Dominic had suggested, a small gravel parking area near an unmarked trailhead. Dominic was already waiting, dressed in hiking gear with a pack that seemed too large for a short day hike. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. As we started walking, he pointed out native plants and animal tracks, his knowledge impressive. But something felt off. He kept checking his watch and occasionally glancing back toward the parking area. The trail grew steeper, more difficult than I had anticipated. "Is the cabin much further?" I asked after we'd been hiking for nearly an hour. "Just beyond that ridge," he replied, pointing to a distant outcropping. "We're making good time, better than the others did." That comment froze me in my tracks. "Others? What others?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual while my heart rate accelerated. Dominic paused, turning to face me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Other hikers," he said after a beat too long. "Most tourists can't handle this trail." He continued walking, and I followed, now hyper-aware of how isolated we were. The woods had grown denser, the trail less defined. I discreetly checked my phone. No signal, as expected. The satellite phone felt heavier in my pack, a reminder that help was technically available, but would require me to stop and set it up, something I couldn't do without Dominic noticing. We crested a hill, and there it was. Not the quaint hunting cabin I'd imagined, but a dilapidated structure that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The door hung at an angle, windows boarded up. This is it. I couldn't hide my disappointment. Dominic's expression darkened. You were expecting something else? Perhaps something more like what Janet was looking for? Or Michael? The names meant nothing to me, but the way he said them sent ice through my veins. I remembered the van from the previous night. Had it really left? Or had Dominic moved it? My mind raced through possibilities as I realized with growing horror that the perfect spot where I'd parked wasn't a coincidence. It was a hunting ground. I need to use the bathroom, I lied, moving toward a cluster of trees, my hand secretly reaching for the bear spray in my jacket pocket. Dominic watched me, his posture changing subtly from guide to predator. There's a proper outhouse behind the cabin, he said, gesturing for me to follow him. I nodded, buying time while scanning the area for escape routes. Inside the cabin was worse than its exterior suggested. The floor was littered with empty beer cans and what looked disturbingly like old bloodstains. But what made my blood run cold were the small tokens hanging from a beam across the ceiling. Car keys, jewelry, and what appeared to be several van keys, dangling like macabre wind chimes. Every winter, Dominic began, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. The mountains claim new victims. Unprepared hikers, they say. Avalanches. Animal attacks. He moved between me and the door. But the locals know better. They know about the winter harvester. My fingers closed around the bear spray as I backed up against the wall. The what? I asked, playing dumb while calculating my odds of making it past him. An old legend, he continued. A trapper who died in these mountains a century ago, starving in a blizzard. Now he returns each winter, taking travelers who won't be missed until spring. His smile turned cruel. Of course, I help him find them. It's a symbiotic relationship. The realization hit me. Dominic wasn't delusional. He was methodical. He targeted solo travelers, people whose disappearances would be attributed to the dangers of winter in remote areas. And Vanlifers were perfect victims, often off-grid, following loose itineraries, sometimes not in regular contact with family. The police have my travel plans, I bluffed. They know I'm with you today. Dominic laughed, a harsh sound in the confined space. No, they don't, Olivia. I watched you yesterday. No calls to the police. No registration at the visitor center. Just your little YouTube videos that no one will miss until long after the snow melts. He reached into his pack and pulled out not a weapon as I expected, but a small wooden carving of a man in trapper's clothes. He's coming soon. The first real snow is tonight. I felt the temperature in the cabin drop, though whether from fear or some supernatural force, I couldn't tell. What I didn't know was that I needed to act now. I have to pee. I insisted again, more urgently. Fine. Dominic sighed, gesturing toward the back door. But I'm coming with you. As we stepped outside, I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt, too large for a person, with what looked like abnormally long fingers dragging alongside. Dominic followed my gaze and smiled. He's already here. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it what sounded like distant, hollow laughter. My rational mind insisted this was elaborate theater designed to terrify me before my very human attacker made his move, but another part of me, the primal part that recognizes danger, wasn't so sure. I made my move as Dominic turned to scan the tree line, his attention split between me and whoever he believed was coming. The bear spray caught him directly in the face, his scream echoing through the trees as I bolted past him, choosing a downhill path that I hoped would lead back to civilization. Behind me, Dominic's screams turned to rage. Then, most disturbing of all, laughter. Run, Olivia, he shouted after me. Make it sporting for him. I crashed through underbrush, branches whipping my face as I ran downhill, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. The logical part of my brain insisted that Dominic was a mundane predator, dangerous but human. The growing darkness and the sounds from the forest suggested otherwise. The temperature was dropping rapidly as evening approached, and the first snowflakes began to fall, far heavier than the forecast had predicted. Within minutes, the ground was covered in white, my footprints marking a clear trail behind me. I needed to find shelter before nightfall, before hypothermia became as much a threat as Dominic or his winter harvester. Through the trees, I spotted what looked like a service road and changed direction, hope surging that it might lead to a ranger station or back to the main park area. The snow was falling in earnest now, reducing visibility to mere yards. But I forced myself to keep moving, listening for sounds of pursuit. What I heard instead stopped me in my tracks, the distant rumble of an engine. Relief flooded through me as I hurried toward the sound, emerging onto a wider trail where, through the curtain of snow, I could make out the headlights of an approaching vehicle. I waved my arms frantically, tears of relief streaming down my face as the vehicle, a park service truck, slowed to a stop. The window rolled down to reveal an older man in a ranger uniform, his expression concerned. "Miss, are you all right?" I stumbled toward him, words tumbling out about Dominic, the cabin, the attack. The ranger's face grew grave as he helped me into the truck. "Dominic Thoreau?" he asked, and my heart sank at the recognition. "You know him?" "Everyone knows Dominic," the ranger said, putting the truck in gear. "He's been telling that winter harvester story to scare tourists for years." He glanced at me. "But he's not a ranger. Never was. He was committed to the psychiatric hospital in Montreal 3 years ago." My relief at rescue turned to ice in my veins. "Then who?" I began, but stopped as the ranger smiled, the same smile Dominic had worn in the cabin. "Dominic's my brother," he said simply, taking a sharp turn onto an unmarked road that led deeper into the darkening forest. "He sends me the special ones, the ones the harvester wants most." As the truck lurched through the snow, I lunged for the door handle, only to find it removed, a smooth metal plate in its place. Through the thickening snow, I could now make out our destination, the same cabin I'd fled, its windows now glowing with eerie blue light from within. I threw myself across the cab of the truck, grabbing for the steering wheel as the fake ranger fought to maintain control. We skidded on the snow-covered road, the truck spinning wildly before slamming into a tree. The impact deployed the airbags, momentarily stunning both of us. I recovered first, kicking at the windshield with all my strength until it cracked, then shattered. Ignoring the glass cutting into my hands, I dragged myself out through the opening, falling onto the snow-covered ground. Behind me, the ranger was stirring, cursing as he struggled with his seatbelt. I didn't wait. I ran, directionless except away from the truck, away from the cabin that I could still see through the trees. Night had fallen completely now, the woods transformed into a labyrinth of shadows. The snow continued to fall, heavy and silent, already several inches deep. I fought to remember my wilderness training. Follow water downhill, look for lights, find shelter. But panic had scrambled my thoughts, leaving only the imperative to keep moving. My clothes, inadequate for a winter night in the Quebec wilderness, were already soaked through. Hypothermia would kill me before morning if I didn't find shelter or help. Through the curtain of snow, I spotted a faint light, different from the unnatural blue glow of the cabin. This was the warm yellow of electric lights, civilization. Hope surged as I changed direction, pushing my freezing body toward that promise of safety. The lights belonged to another cabin, this one well-maintained and modern, smoke curling from its chimney. I stumbled onto the porch and pounded on the door, sobbing with relief when it opened to reveal an elderly couple, their faces concerned. "Help me," I managed to choke out before collapsing into their startled arms. They brought me inside, wrapped me in blankets, and gave me hot tea while I poured out my story. They exchanged troubled glances as I spoke of Dominic and his brother, the winter harvester legend. "We need to call the police," I insisted, reaching for the phone on their wall. The old woman placed her hand gently on mine, stopping me. "No need for that," she said, her voice suddenly familiar. "Family matters should stay in the family." It was then I noticed the photographs on their mantle, younger versions of themselves with 2 boys. One was unmistakably Dominic. The old man sighed heavily as he moved to lock the door. "Our sons have always been troubled," he explained, as if discussing nothing more serious than poor grades. "But they bring us the ones who trespass, the ones who don't respect our mountain." Outside, the wind had stopped. The sudden silence was broken by the sound of footsteps on the porch, heavy, dragging steps that could not possibly belong to either Dominic or his brother. As the door began to open despite the lock, the old woman smiled at me with genuine sadness. "The harvester isn't a legend, dear. He's family too. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was a tall figure in the doorway, wearing the faded clothes of a century ago, snow falling through the empty space where a face should have been. We're a couple from Vancouver who decided to spend the winter in our newly converted van exploring Quebec. When we arrive in Mont-Tremblant, we come across a mysterious local festival that only takes place during the winter solstice. As we are drawn into the celebrations, we slowly realize that we have been selected as this year's sacrifices for an ancient ritual that keeps the ski resort thriving. My name is Meredith Chun, 29 years old, and until 3 months ago, I'd been working as an architect in Vancouver. Ethan and I had spent our savings converting an old Ford Transit into our dream home on wheels, determined to spend a year traveling across Canada before settling down to start a family. The plan was to chase summer, but Ethan, ever the contrarian, had insisted we experience a proper Quebec winter. Coming Mayor, Ethan called back, his voice muffled through the van's insulated walls. At 34, my husband still had the enthusiasm of a child when it came to new experiences. It was one of the things I loved most about him, even when it led us to questionable decisions, like parking our van in a remote area outside Mont-Tremblant in December when temperatures regularly dropped to -20. We'd found this spot through a Vanlife app, a small clearing just off a service road, far enough from the main resort to be legal for overnight parking, but close enough that we could walk to the village. The listing had mentioned incredible views and reliable cell service, both of which proved accurate. Ethan finally emerged from the van, wrapping his arms around me from behind as we both stared at the lights of the resort. "Worth the drive from Vancouver?" he asked, nuzzling into my neck. Before I could answer, a flash of movement caught my eye. Torches, dozens of them, moving through the trees between us and the resort. "What's that?" I pointed. Ethan squinted through his glasses, then pulled out his phone. "Nothing on the resort website about a torchlight parade tonight," he said after a quick search. Curiosity piqued, we decided to follow the lights. In hindsight, curiosity seems such an innocent word for what drove us into those woods, toward the chanting we began to hear as we drew closer to the procession. The locals spotted us before we could retreat into the shadows. A tall woman with silver hair, carrying one of the largest torches, broke from the group and approached us with a smile that seemed genuine, if surprised. "You are visitors?" she asked in accented English. When we nodded, her smile widened. "Then you must join us. The Solstice Festival happens only once a year and brings good fortune to those who participate." The mention of a festival dispelled our initial unease. Festivals meant food, drinks, and local culture, exactly the kind of authentic experience we'd left Vancouver to find. We fell in step with the procession, accepting small wooden cups of a sweet, warming liqueur that tasted of berries and something unfamiliar. The woman introduced herself as Celeste, a lifelong resident of Mont-Tremblant, and explained that the festival dated back to before the resort existed. The procession led us to a clearing where a massive bonfire was already blazing. Around it stood perhaps 100 locals, all ages, all watching our approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to something that, in my slightly dizzy state, I might have called hunger. "The honored guests have arrived," Celeste announced, her voice carrying across the clearing. A murmur went through the crowd, and I felt Ethan's hand tighten around mine. "Did you tell her we were coming?" he whispered. I shook my head, the sweet liqueur making my thoughts fuzzy around the edges. Before I could voice my growing concern, we were ushered to seats near the fire, wooden thrones adorned with antlers and dried flowers. "Every year," Celeste explained as we were seated, "we choose 2 visitors to be our winter monarchs. You will reign over our festival, bringing prosperity to our mountains." I wanted to ask how they'd chosen us when they hadn't known we were coming, but the words wouldn't form properly. Around us, the gathering had begun a slow, rhythmic chant, their voices blending with the crackling of the massive fire. Young children approached, placing wreaths of evergreen and strange white flowers on our heads. "What are these flowers?" I managed to ask, touching the soft petals. "Ghost orchids," replied an elderly man standing nearby. "They only bloom here, only in winter, and only after being nourished with the right elements." The ceremony continued for hours, though time became difficult to track. We were fed rich stews and sweet cakes, given more of the berry liqueur, and treated to stories of Mont Tremblant's history, a history very different from the one in tourist brochures. They spoke of the mountain as a living entity, one that required regular tributes to prevent avalanches and ensure abundant snowfall. Before the resort, one old woman told us, her eyes reflecting the flames, there were many tragedies, many deaths in winter, until we learned what the mountain wanted. Something about her tone finally cut through the pleasant haze that had enveloped me since drinking the liqueur. I turned to Ethan, finding his eyes clearer than I expected. He'd been pretending to drink, I realized, while I'd consumed cup after cup. We should head back, Ethan said firmly, standing and helping me to my feet. Our dog is alone in the van. We didn't have a dog. It was our code for danger, established months ago during a sketchy encounter at a rest stop in Manitoba. The crowd's reaction was immediate and unsettling. The chanting stopped. Celeste's warm smile vanished. The ceremony is not complete, she said, her voice no longer friendly. The mountain has chosen you. Two large men stepped forward, blocking our path back toward our van. Ethan's arm went around my waist, supporting me as the effects of whatever had been in that drink made the clearing spin around us. We're leaving, he insisted, his voice steady despite the fear I could feel in his tense muscles. That's when we noticed that the crowd had formed a complete circle around us. There was no longer a path out. The last outsiders who refused their honor brought death to 16 skiers, Celeste said, her voice carrying across the now silent clearing. An avalanche that the resort called unprecedented. We know better. Around us, faces hardened with resolve and what I now recognized as fear, not of us, but of what might happen if we left. I leaned heavily against Ethan, my mind racing through options despite the fog still clouding my thoughts. The bonfire cast long shadows across the snow, making the gathered crowd seem to waver and grow before my eyes. What exactly does being winter monarchs entail? Ethan asked, his voice steady but his fingers digging into my side in warning. Play along, his touch said. By time. Celeste approached us, her silver hair gleaming in the firelight. You will be taken to the heart of the mountain, a cave system beneath the resort. There, you will commune with the spirit of Mont Tremblant and offer yourselves as vessels for its power. The clinical part of my architect's brain noted the careful choice of words. Offer yourselves and vessels instead of sacrifices or victims. But the meaning was clear enough. Whatever happened in that cave, Meredith and Ethan Chun would not be returning to their van afterward. And if we refuse? Ethan pressed, his arm tightening around me as several members of the crowd moved closer. Celeste's smile returned, but it no longer reached her eyes. No one refuses. The liqueur ensures compliance. As if on cue, my knees buckled. The drug, for surely that's what had been in the sweet drink, was taking stronger hold. Ethan caught me before I hit the ground, but I could tell from his sudden unsteadiness that his own sobriety had been an illusion, his symptoms merely delayed. You drank less, Celeste observed with clinical interest, but no one escapes the embrace of winter entirely. The crowd began to move, forming into two lines. Four young men approached with a stretcher made of branches and animal hides. Don't fight, the elderly man from earlier advised, almost kindly. The more you struggle, the more painful the communion becomes. As they reached for me, Ethan made his move, shoving the nearest man backward and pulling something from his pocket. It was our van's emergency flare, the bright red cylinder casting an eerie glow as Ethan ignited it. Back off, he shouted, waving the flare toward the closest members of the crowd. They retreated a few steps, expressions more annoyed than frightened. The mountain resort is that way, Ethan said to me, pointing with his free hand. Run along the tree line. I'll be right behind you. I wanted to protest, leaving him alone against so many, but my leaden legs were already moving, driven by terror and survival instinct. Behind me, I heard shouts as Ethan presumably used the flare to create distance. I forced my drugged body forward, knowing that our only hope was reaching the resort and its tourists and security cameras. The cold air was clearing my head slightly, but my movements remained clumsy, my path anything but straight. I heard Ethan cry out behind me, followed by the sound of a struggle. Against all instinct, I kept running, tears freezing on my cheeks as I pushed through the underbrush toward the distant lights of the resort. The trees grew denser, the ground more uneven. Something caught my foot, a root or buried branch, sending me tumbling down a short but steep embankment. Pain shot through my ankle as I tried to stand, the injury compounding my drug-impaired coordination. I could hear pursuit now, voices calling to each other through the trees, the beam of flashlights sweeping the forest floor. I dragged myself into the hollow beneath a fallen tree, making myself as small as possible as the search party approached. "She's injured," a man's voice said. "There's blood on the snow." Another voice, Celeste's, replied with chilling certainty. "It doesn't matter. The mountain will guide us to her." I don't know how long I huddled in that freezing hollow, my body alternating between drug-induced lethargy and spikes of adrenaline every time a searcher passed nearby. The night grew colder, my wet clothing freezing against my skin. Hypothermia would claim me if I didn't move soon, but movement meant discovery. As the sounds of pursuit gradually moved further away, I made my decision. I had to try for the resort again. Crawling from my hiding place, I tested my injured ankle. It could bear weight, barely, but each step sent shooting pain up my leg. Using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch, I oriented myself toward where I thought the resort should be and began my agonizing journey. The forest played tricks on me. Paths that seemed to lead toward the distant lights would curve away or end at impassable terrain. My head still swam from whatever had been in that drink, making navigation even more difficult. Twice I found myself walking in circles, my own tracks in the snow mocking my efforts to escape. The third time I recognized my tracks, something else caught my eye. Another set of footprints, larger than mine, moving parallel to my path about 20 yards to my right. They hadn't been there earlier. Someone was tracking me, hurting me like a wounded animal. I changed direction abruptly, ignoring the screaming pain in my ankle as I pushed through a dense thicket of pines, determined to break the pattern. I emerged onto what appeared to be a service road, plowed, with tire tracks indicating recent use. Hope surged as I hobbled along it, reasoning that any road must eventually lead to the resort or at least to people not involved in drugging tourists for sacrifice. The sky was beginning to lighten, dawn approaching, when I heard the most beautiful sound, the mechanical rumble of a snowmobile. I waved frantically as the vehicle rounded a curve, tears of relief streaming down my face as it slowed to a stop. The driver, bundled in resort-branded winter gear, lifted his goggles. "Ma'am, are you all right?" His normal, concerned, utterly ordinary face was the most wonderful thing I'd ever seen. I stumbled toward him, words pouring out about Ethan, the ceremony, the cave. The patrol officer, Mark, according to his name tag, helped me onto the back of his snowmobile and radioed his base. "I've got an injured woman on the North Service Road," he reported. "Possible hypothermia, confusion, and ankle injury. She's reporting her husband might be in danger." As we sped toward the resort, hope began to replace fear. There would be police, cameras, witnesses. The cultists couldn't reach us there. Mark brought me directly to the resort's medical center, where the staff took my information and began treatment for my injuries. I insisted they call the police immediately, repeating my story about the Solstice Festival and Ethan's abduction. The doctor exchanged looks with the nurse before gently suggesting I might be experiencing confusion from hypothermia and possible recreational substances. "No one uses that clearing in winter," the doctor explained as he wrapped my ankle. "And there's no Solstice Festival in Mont Tremblant." Before I could argue further, the door opened and Celeste walked in, now dressed in the crisp uniform of the resort's management. "Ms. Chun," she said, her voice professionally concerned. "We've been so worried. Your husband is waiting for you." My blood turned to ice as the doctor and nurse nodded respectfully to her. "Celeste is our director of guest services," the doctor explained, missing or ignoring my expression of terror. "She'll make sure you're taken care of." Behind her, in the doorway, stood the two large men who had blocked our escape from the clearing. One of them was pushing a wheelchair. "The communion was interrupted," Celeste said softly as the medical staff stepped away to give us privacy. "The mountain still waits for its winter monarchs." "Where's Ethan?" I demanded, backing away until I hit the examination table. My voice sounded stronger than I felt. Celeste's professional mask slipped, just for an instant, revealing the same zealot from the forest. "Preparing for your arrival," she replied smoothly. He's been most cooperative since understanding the importance of the ceremony. She signaled to the men, who moved toward me with practiced efficiency. I grabbed a metal tray of medical instruments, hurling it at the closest one before lunging toward the door. My injured ankle buckled immediately, sending me crashing into a cabinet. As I struggled to rise, Celeste knelt beside me, something gleaming in her hand, a syringe. "This would have been so much easier in the forest," she murmured, almost regretfully. The needle never reached my skin. The door burst open, revealing a police officer, and behind him, impossibly, Ethan, bruised but standing, his eyes clear and focused. "That's her," he said, pointing at Celeste, the leader of the group that drugged and abducted us. More officers flooded the room, restraining Celeste and her associates. Ethan pushed past them to reach me, gathering me into his arms as I sobbed with relief and confusion. "How?" I managed to ask as the chaos unfolded around us. "How did you escape? How did you find me?" Ethan's face darkened as he helped me to a proper chair, well away from the wheelchair they'd brought for me. "I didn't escape," he said quietly. "They let me go? Deliberately." As paramedics from outside the resort arrived to properly treat us both, Ethan explained in hushed tones. After I'd fled, he'd been quickly overwhelmed despite the flare. Rather than harm him, they'd taken him to the cave system beneath the resort, accessible through maintenance tunnels in the ski infrastructure. "They showed me the heart of the mountain," he said, his voice hollow with remembered horror. "It wasn't a metaphor, Mare. There was something down there, something ancient. They've been feeding it for generations. The communion," Ethan explained, "wasn't death, at least not immediately. The chosen monarchs were secured in a chamber where their fear and pain would somehow nourish the entity. Previous victims were there, some dating back decades, kept alive in a state of perpetual terror. They told me they needed both of us." Ethan continued as we were loaded into an ambulance. "The ritual requires a pair. When you escaped, they decided to let me go, to track me, knowing I'd lead them to you." He'd played along, pretending to understand their beliefs, until they brought him back to the resort. There, he'd managed to slip away and find actual police, not the resort security who, he'd discovered, were largely complicit in the ritual. "The entity preserves the perfect snow conditions," he explained, still sounding dazed by the revelation. "That's why Mont Tremblant always has perfect powder when other resorts struggle. That's why they protect it. Tourism is everything here." As the ambulance doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of the resort through the window. Pristine, beautiful, and suddenly terrifying in its perfection. Celeste was being led to a police car, but her expression held no fear or remorse, only patient certainty. She caught my eye and smiled that same warm smile from the forest. Only now did I understand why it had never reached her eyes. The police officer who had rescued us approached the ambulance before we departed. "We'll need full statements," he said, his French accent thick. "This cult has operated for too long." A call came through on his radio, and his face clouded as he listened to the rapid French. "What is it?" Ethan asked. The officer hesitated before responding. "The suspects are claiming diplomatic immunity," he said finally. "They say the resort is considered sovereign territory under an agreement dating back to the 1940s. As the ambulance pulled away, taking us toward a hospital in Montreal, my phone buzzed with an incoming text. Unknown number. I almost didn't look, but something compelled me to check the screen. The message was simple. "The mountain does not forget its chosen ones. Winter is long." Attached was a photo of our van, our home, now parked at the base of a snowy cliff, directly in the path of what any skier would recognize as prime avalanche terrain. I showed the message to Ethan without a word. He took the phone from my trembling hands and powered it off completely before taking my hand in his. Outside the ambulance windows, snow began to fall again. Perfect, powdery snow that would delight thousands of tourists, none of whom would ever know what lay beneath the immaculate slopes of Mont Tremblant, or what price was paid for their winter wonderland. I'm a digital nomad from Seattle, and I parked my van near the historic Petit Champlain neighborhood in Quebec City during the Winter Carnival. I became friends with a local craftsman, ended up getting involved in a centuries-old blood feud between the town's founding families that has victimized countless tourists, and unfortunately I got into their territorial dispute. My name is Marcus Reeves, 36 years old, a software developer from Seattle who had embraced remote work and van life 3 years ago after my divorce. The pandemic had taught many of us that we could work from anywhere, but I was one of the few who took that lesson literally, converting a Mercedes Sprinter into a mobile office and home that had carried me through 47 states and now, finally, into Canada during its most brutal season. February in Quebec City meant the Winter Carnival was in full swing, with ice sculptures and festive lights transforming the oldest city in North America into something from a fairy tale, albeit a fairy tale where the temperature regularly plunged to -20 Celsius. I'd chosen my parking spot carefully, close enough to public restrooms and cafes with Wi-Fi, far enough from residential areas to avoid complaints, and most importantly, outside the zones where parking was explicitly forbidden. Still, I worried each time I returned that I'd find a ticket or, worse, discover my home had been towed. Tonight, however, Nova, my van's name, inspired by its deep blue exterior, sat undisturbed where I'd left it, frost creating intricate patterns across its windows. As I approached, fumbling for my keys with gloved hands, I noticed something unusual, a small wooden carving placed carefully on my front tire, a miniature replica of my van detailed down to its solar panels and roof vent. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind sold in the boutiques along Rue du Petit Champlain for hundreds of dollars. I looked around, wondering if someone had mistakenly left their purchase, but the narrow street was empty except for a few tourists hurrying toward the funicular that connected Lower Town to the historic Upper Town. Taking the carving inside, I examined it under my van's LED lights. The detail was even more impressive up close, including a tiny version of my Seattle Seahawks bumper sticker. This was no coincidence. Someone had specifically carved my van. On the underside was an inscription, Bienvenue à Quebec. Meet me at Café Buade tomorrow, noon. Laurent. I placed the carving on my dashboard, intrigued but cautious. In my years of travel, I'd learned that unexpected invitations could lead to the best experiences, or the worst. The next day, curiosity won over caution. Café Buade sat across from the famous Notre Dame de Quebec Basilica Cathedral in Upper Town, its interior warm and fragrant with coffee and pastries. I spotted him immediately, a man in his early 40s with skilled hands and observant eyes, sitting at a corner table with 2 steaming mugs. "Marcus," he said as I approached, standing to shake my hand. "I'm Laurent Boucher. Thank you for coming." His English was excellent, with just enough French accent to remind me I was far from home. When I asked about the carving, he smiled. "I have a shop near where you parked. I noticed your van. It's distinctive. I've been watching you come and go for 3 days." Before I could decide if this was creepy or merely European directness, he leaned forward. "I need your help, and in return, I can offer you the best parking spot in Lower Town, with electricity and water hookups. All I ask is that you move your van exactly where I tell you, when I tell you." "That's an unusual offer," I said, wrapping my hands around the mug of rich hot chocolate Laurent had ordered for me. "Why would where I park matter to you?" Laurent's eyes darted to the cafe entrance before he responded, his voice lowered. "Because your van is unique, American plates, distinctive build. It's perfect." "Perfect for what?" He wouldn't immediately say, instead changing the subject to ask about my travels, my work, how I was enjoying Quebec City. I answered his questions while trying to formulate my own, increasingly certain that whatever Laurent wanted went beyond friendly interest in a fellow craftsman. I'd mentioned my woodworking hobby when complimenting his carving. After nearly an hour of circling conversation, Laurent finally revealed his true purpose. "Quebec City is old by North American standards," he began, stirring his 3rd espresso. "With age comes history, and with history comes grudges." He explained that his family, the Bouchers, had been in Quebec since its founding, as had the Pelletiers, another family with whom they shared a centuries-old dispute over property boundaries. What began as a simple survey error in 1659 has become something more dangerous, Laurent continued. "Every generation, the conflict renews. My father lost his woodshop to arson. My grandfather was crippled in a hunting accident. The Pelletiers own much of the commercial property in Lower Town, including the narrow street where I'd been parking. Laurent's shop was the last Boucher holdout in what had once been their family's territory. I still don't understand what this has to do with my van. I pressed, increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Laurent leaned forward again, his voice barely above a whisper. The Pelletiers are superstitious. They believe in signs and omens. Your blue van parked in their territory for 7 consecutive days would be considered a terrible portent, the color of mourning, the number of misfortune. He smiled thinly. It would distract them while I finalized the paperwork on a property acquisition they don't yet know about. I sat back, half convinced Laurent was playing an elaborate joke. You want to use my van as some kind of psychological warfare? Against a rival family? Based on superstition? Laurent didn't smile. You wouldn't be the first traveler drawn into our conflict, but you would be the first to benefit from it, rather than suffer. Before I could respond, the cafe door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a woman who immediately caught Laurent's attention. He stiffened, his expression shifting from earnest to cautious. "Speak of the devil," he murmured as the woman approached our table. She was perhaps 30, stylishly dressed in a red wool coat, her dark hair pulled back from a face that might have been beautiful if not for the coldness in her eyes. "Laurent," she said, her tone falsely warm, "introducing another tourist to our little city's charms." She turned to me, extending a gloved hand. "Isabelle Pelletier. I own the gallery across from Laurent's shop. You must be the owner of the blue van that's been brightening our street." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You should be careful where you park. The city is very strict during carnival season. Many vehicles are towed or..." She paused meaningfully, damaged by snowplows. That afternoon, I sat in Nova, heater running against the bone-deep chill, researching Quebec City's history on my laptop. I found plenty about the founding families, including the Bouchers and Pelletiers, but nothing about a feud. Yet something in Isabelle's thinly veiled threat made me believe Laurent wasn't entirely fabricating the rivalry. As darkness fell, I decided to move my van, not to Laurent's suggested spot, but to a public parking garage several blocks away. The daily rate would destroy my budget, but it felt safer than remaining a pawn in whatever game these families were playing. As I turned the key in the ignition, there was a tap at my window. I jumped, then relaxed, seeing a familiar face. Jerome, a fellow Vanlifer from Toronto whom I'd met 2 days earlier. "Going somewhere?" Jerome asked when I rolled down the window. I hesitated, then gave him an edited version of my strange day. Instead of the skepticism I expected, Jerome's face grew serious. "I've heard rumors about those families," he said. "Last winter, an American couple in an RV parked on that street for about a week. They were found frozen to death inside their vehicle, carbon monoxide poisoning from a blocked exhaust pipe. Officials blamed snow accumulation, but..." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. "Move to the parking garage," he advised. "I'm heading there myself. Safety in numbers, right?" Relieved to have an ally, I agreed to follow his van. The route Jerome took wasn't direct, winding through narrow streets still decorated for carnival. Avoiding the main roads, he explained via text when I questioned him. Too much traffic. It wasn't until we turned down an especially narrow alley, barely wide enough for our vehicles, that alarm bells began ringing in my mind. This wasn't the way to any parking garage. Before I could reverse, a car appeared behind me, blocking my escape. Jerome's van stopped ahead, and he emerged not with an explanation, but with a man I recognized from a photo in Laurent's shop, Laurent's brother, Philip. As they approached my van, Jerome's expression held none of the friendliness from earlier. "The Bouchers are paying me well to deliver you," he said when I cracked the window. "Nothing personal, just van life economics. My options were limited, too narrow to open doors fully, no way to drive forward or back. What do you want?" I demanded as Philip circled to my passenger side. "Just your van, exactly where we need it," Philip replied. "You can stay inside or walk away, your choice." When I reached for my phone, Jerome laughed. "No service in this alley. Old stone buildings block the signal." I considered my options. I could trigger my van's alarm, possibly attracting attention, but in the middle of carnival with music and crowds, who would notice? I could refuse to move, but they could simply wait me out, or worse. "Fine," I said finally. "Tell me where to park, and I'll do it. Then I'm leaving town tonight." Philip smiled, the expression chillingly similar to his brother's. "That would be best for everyone," he agreed, before giving me directions to a spot directly in front of the Pelletier Gallery. Following their instructions felt like surrender, but self-preservation won over pride. They escorted me to the designated spot, Jerome ahead, Philip's car behind, and watched as I parked exactly as directed, my van's blue bulk reflected in the darkened windows of Isabel's gallery. "Stay there until midnight," Philip instructed. "Then you're free to go." He handed me an envelope. "For your trouble." Inside was enough Canadian cash to cover a week in the parking garage I'd originally aimed for, plus expenses. As they left, I locked my doors and tried to settle in for the wait, running through escape scenarios if things went sideways. The street was quiet now, most carnival festivities concentrated in other areas. Snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier, muffling the few sounds of the city that reached this far. Around 11, movement caught my eye, a figure approaching my van, not from the direction of Lawrence's shop, but from the gallery. Isabel, wrapped in her red coat, her breath visible in the freezing air. I rolled down my window just enough to hear her. "You should leave," she said without preamble. "Now? Whatever they're paying you, it's not worth it." There was no artifice in her voice now, just genuine concern. "What's happening at midnight?" I asked. She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "The anniversary of the original dispute. They're marking your van as their territory, a symbolic reclaiming." When I told her about Lawrence's superstition story, she laughed bitterly. "The Bouchers aren't superstitious. They're calculating. The last 3 vehicles that parked here on this date were vandalized, their owners attacked. The police call it carnival crime, but we know better." I believed her, not because she seemed more trustworthy than Laurent, but because fear is difficult to fake, and Isabel was afraid. "Why warn me?" I asked. "Laurent said your families hate each other." Isabel's expression hardened. "We do, but I don't extend that hatred to innocent people they manipulate." She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a newspaper clipping, passing it through the narrow window opening. The headline read, "Tourist found dead in van. Police suspect foul play." The article, dated exactly 1 year earlier, detailed how an Australian traveler had been stabbed inside his vehicle, which had been parked precisely where I was now. "They're not marking territory," Isabel said quietly. "They're recreating a crime scene, with you as this year's victim." Before I could respond, headlights swept the street, multiple vehicles approaching from both directions. Isabel's eyes widened. "They're early. Run. Now." Without waiting for my response, she hurried back toward her gallery. I had seconds to decide. Trust the woman who'd just warned me, or dismiss her story as another manipulation in this bizarre feud. The approaching vehicles settled it, 3 vans, similar to mine, creating a barricade at each end of the street. I grabbed my essentials, passport, wallet, phone, laptop, and slipped out the side door, staying low between parked cars as I made my way toward a narrow passage between buildings that Isabel had indicated. Behind me, I heard car doors opening, men's voices calling out. Something shattered, my van's window, I realized with a spike of anger and fear. I'd rebuilt Nova myself after the divorce, pouring thousands of hours and dollars into her conversion. Now she was being sacrificed to a conflict I still didn't understand. The passage led to a parallel street, equally historic but bustling with carnival activity. I blended into the crowd, putting distance between myself and my van while trying to formulate a plan. The police station was my logical destination, but I hesitated. What exactly would I report? That 2 prominent local families were using my vehicle in some kind of annual ritual reenactment of a crime? That I'd been paid to park there, making me technically complicit? I found a 24-hour cafe with Wi-Fi and huddled in a corner, researching past incidents on the street where I'd left Nova. What I found chilled me more than the February air. 4 tourist vehicles vandalized or broken into on the same date over the past 4 years. 1 death, the Australian. 2 assaults, all dismissed as carnival-related crime spikes. I was composing an email to the police with my information when the cafe door opened and Laurent entered, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. He crossed to my table and sat without invitation, his expression grave. "You weren't supposed to leave the van," he said without preamble. "You've ruined everything." Outside, sirens wailed, growing closer. Lawrence's mouth tightened. "Police. Right on schedule." Confusion gave way to understanding as pieces fell into place. Lawrence's insistence on my specific parking spot, Jerome's betrayal, Isabel's warning. "You set me up," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. American tourist attacks local businessman. Or maybe local businessman defends himself against American tourist. Which headline were you going for? Laurent didn't deny it. Every year, one of us has to pay the price, he said, almost resignedly. It's been this way since my grandfather killed Isabel's grandfather over a property line in 1957. The families agreed. A symbolic restoration of balance each February 15th. One outsider, chosen carefully, becomes the sacrifice. He checked his watch. But you left, so now there's no balance. The debt remains unpaid. Through the cafe window, I saw police lights reflecting off the snow-covered street. 2 officers entered, scanning the room just as Laurent had moments earlier. Laurent stood, subtly positioning himself to block their view of me. You have 2 choices, he said quietly. Stay and try to explain a story no one will believe, or leave Quebec now. There's a bus to Montreal in 30 minutes. I chose the third option. I waved the officers over. As they approached, Laurent's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty. I addressed the officers in my limited French, then switched to English when they responded in kind. This man paid me to park my van on Rue du Petit Champlain. I began, showing them the envelope of cash. Now people are vandalizing it. The older officer's expression changed as he looked from me to Laurent. The blue van. We just received reports of a disturbance there. He studied Laurent with recognition. Monsieur Boucher. February 15th again. The younger officer was already speaking into his radio, requesting backup. Laurent remained silent. His earlier confidence evaporated. What I learned in the hours that followed defied belief. The feud between the families was real but had evolved into something darker. A pact made decades ago after a deadly confrontation had nearly destroyed both families. Each year, they selected an outsider to serve as a symbolic sacrifice, staging incidents that ranged from vandalism to, in recent years, actual violence. The police had suspected but could never prove the pattern, lacking witnesses willing to testify. The officers showed me photos of my van, windows shattered, interior ransacked, and most disturbing, a word painted across the blue exterior, "Quilibra," balance. But in their haste after I'd fled, the Bouchers had been sloppy. Security cameras from a nearby hotel had captured clear images of Laurent's brother and 2 others attacking my vehicle. More importantly, forensic evidence connected them to last year's fatal stabbing of the Australian tourist. As I sat in the police station, giving my statement for what felt like the 100th time, Isabelle Pelletier arrived. She looked smaller without her red coat, more vulnerable. You broke the cycle, she said simply, sitting beside me. For decades, our families have been trapped in this ritual, each year thinking this is the last time, but it never was. She twisted her hands in her lap. I warned you not because I'm better than them, but because I wanted out. Sacrificing strangers became too easy. Outside the station's windows, dawn was breaking over Quebec City, carnival decorations now seeming macabre rather than festive. Nova was gone, impounded as evidence in what would become a multiple homicide investigation spanning years. My home, my transport, my livelihood, all casualties of a conflict that predated my grandparents. As if reading my thoughts, Isabelle placed a set of keys on the table between us. My family owns a small apartment above the gallery. It's yours until you decide what's next. I stared at the keys, understanding the offer for what it was, not compensation, but the first fragile attempt at breaking a cycle of violence that had claimed too many innocent travelers who'd simply parked in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm a travel vlogger from Miami, and I parked my van at the supposedly haunted Forges du Saint-Maurice, Quebec's first industrial community. While I'm documenting the place for my channel, I uncover evidence that the local historical society is using ghost stories to cover up illegal archaeological looting. But they eventually realize that I had images of their activities, and they start chasing me. My name is Zoe Cardenas, 27 years old, a travel vlogger from Miami whose channel Nomadic Nightmares specialized in supposedly haunted locations across North America. I'd been living in my converted Ford Transit, affectionately named Phantom, for nearly 2 years, chasing stories that made viewers' skin crawl while secretly being the world's biggest skeptic. The irony wasn't lost on me that I made my living from ghost stories I didn't believe in, but my theater background helped me sell wide-eyed fear to my 500,000 subscribers. Trois-Rivières wasn't originally on my itinerary, but when 3 separate followers messaged me about paranormal experiences at the old ironworks, I knew I'd found my next viral video. This is where they made Canada's cannons, explained Richard Tremblay, the silver-haired docent who'd agreed to let me film after hours. The forges operated from 1730 until 1883, employing hundreds of workers who lived right on this site. Richard was a member of the Trois-Rivières Historical Society and seemed genuinely enthusiastic about my interest, though he'd initially been hesitant about the paranormal angle. "We prefer to focus on the historical significance," he'd said over the phone. "But I suppose the ghost stories bring in younger visitors." Now, as the site emptied of tourists, Richard walked me through the remaining structures: the blast furnace, the forge, the owner's house, sharing historical details while occasionally indulging my questions about reported hauntings. "The most common sighting is the Veiled Lady," Richard said as we approached the Grande Maison, where the ironworks managers had lived. "People claim to see her in the upper windows, watching the forges as if waiting for someone to return." His tone was academic, but I noticed how his eyes darted toward those same windows as he spoke. Workers also report hearing hammering sounds from the empty forge building, usually around 3 a.m., the time when the night shift would have been in full swing during the 1800s. I nodded, setting up my tripod for an establishing shot of the main grounds. As Richard continued his history lesson, something caught my eye, a flash of light from the woods beyond the restoration area, gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Is anyone else working here tonight?" I asked casually. Richard glanced in the direction I indicated, his expression shifting subtly before he smiled. "No, the site closes at sunset. Must have been a reflection from the river." By the time Richard left me to experience the atmosphere, alone, with special permission and strict instructions not to enter any locked buildings, darkness had fully descended on the forges. I set up my cameras, one on the tripod for wide shots, another strapped to my chest for reaction footage, and several small battery-operated units I planned to leave running overnight in key locations. The September air was surprisingly cold for someone used to Miami's perpetual summer, and I pulled my jacket tighter as I walked the grounds, narrating in hushed tones about the site's history and reported phenomena. "Legend says the sounds of industry still echo here," I whispered into my camera. "The spirits of workers continuing their labors long after death." The performance came naturally after years of practice, though privately I attributed any strange sounds to wind, wildlife, and the natural settling of old structures. What I didn't attribute to natural causes, however, was the distinct beam of a flashlight I spotted moving inside the locked forge building, a structure Richard had specifically forbidden me to enter. Decision time. Follow my docent's instructions and ignore potential trespassers, or investigate what could be either vandals or fellow ghost hunters who'd somehow gained access. The content creator in me knew which would make better footage. Making sure my chest camera was running, I approached the forge building quietly, using only my phone's dim screen for minimal illumination. The massive wooden door was still secured with the heavy padlock I'd noted earlier, but as I circled the structure, I discovered a small window with broken boards, just large enough for someone to squeeze through. Inside, I could hear muffled voices and see the occasional sweep of flashlight beams. Hoisting myself up to the opening, I positioned my phone to record through the gap, catching glimpses of 3 figures moving methodically through the historic forge. They weren't acting like vandals or thrill-seekers. Their movements were purposeful, directed, as they examined the packed earth floor with what appeared to be metal detectors and other equipment I couldn't identify in the darkness. One man knelt, digging carefully at a spot near the old furnace, while another photographed whatever he extracted. The third person, a woman whose silhouette seemed oddly familiar, kept watch, her flashlight beam occasionally sweeping toward the windows. I ducked down when the light approached my position, heart hammering against my chest cam. When I dared look again, the man had pulled something from the ground, something that glinted dully in the flashlight beam. "Colonial era," I heard him say, his voice carrying in the quiet building. "Pre-conquest. Definitely museum quality." I'd seen enough to know this wasn't official archaeological work. Not at night, not through a broken window, not with Richard's insistence that no one else would be on site. As I carefully backed away from my observation post, my elbow knocked loose a piece of rotting wood. The noise wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it might as well have been a gunshot. Inside, the flashlights immediately went dark. I heard urgent whispers, then silence. Fight or flight kicked in, and I chose flight, moving as quickly and quietly as possible toward the main grounds where I'd left my tripod. I needed to grab my equipment and get back to my van, parked in the visitor's lot about a quarter-mile away. As I reached for my tripod, headlights swept the parking area, a vehicle approaching well after closing time. The approaching vehicle parked beside my van, its headlights extinguishing to reveal a dark SUV with no markings. Two figures emerged, one unmistakably Richard Tremblay, though his earlier docent demeanor had vanished. He spoke urgently to his companion, pointing toward the forge building I'd just fled from. From my concealed position behind the Grande Maison, I couldn't hear their words, but their body language conveyed tension and purpose. I remained frozen, calculating my options. My van was now effectively blocked by their vehicle. The main road was a good 15-minute walk through woods I didn't know. The battery on my phone showed 12%, enough to call for help if I could get a signal, which had been spotty since arriving at the historic site. As the pair moved toward the forge, I made my decision. I'd circle back to the visitor center, which Richard had mentioned had Wi-Fi and a landline. But as I turned to implement this plan, I came face to face with the woman I'd seen in the forge, her flashlight now aimed directly at my eyes. "Well," she said, her voice unsettlingly calm, "it seems our little ghost has arrived right on schedule. Archaeological looting is a federal offense," I blurted out, immediately regretting revealing what I'd witnessed. The woman, middle-aged, with a museum curator's sensible clothing and severe bun, smiled thinly. "So is trespassing after hours," she countered, though we both knew Richard had given me permission. "Cassandra LeBlanc," she introduced herself with unexpected formality, "director of the Trois-Rivières Historical Society." She lowered her flashlight slightly. "And you, Ms. Cardenas, have stumbled into something considerably more complex than ghost hunting." My chest camera was still recording, I realized, capturing this conversation, her admission of identity. Cassandra seemed to read my thoughts. "The camera, please," she said, extending her hand. "Both of them, actually. And your phone." When I hesitated, she added, "Richard mentioned you set up several recording devices around the property. We'll need those as well." Stalling for time, I asked the obvious question, "What are you doing in there?" "Those artifacts belong in a museum." Cassandra's expression flickered between annoyance and amusement. "They're going to a museum, just not the official provincial one, with its years-long backlog and inadequate storage facilities." She stepped closer. "The forges contain thousands of artifacts spanning 150 years of industrial history. The government has funding to excavate perhaps 2% of the site. The rest," she shrugged, "left in the ground to deteriorate, or worse, discovered by actual looters with metal detectors and shovels who sell to private collectors." From the direction of the forge came the sound of approaching voices, the two men I'd seen inside, now joined by Richard. I weighed my options, surrender my evidence and equipment, or make a break for it. Neither choice appealed. What happened next was either incredible luck or proof that my skepticism was misplaced. A deep, resonant sound, like metal striking metal, echoed from the empty furnace building. Everyone froze. The sound came again, followed by what could only be described as the roar of a blast furnace coming to life, though the actual furnace had been cold for over a century. One of the approaching men cursed in French. "Not now," Cassandra muttered, turning toward the noise. In that moment of distraction, I bolted, not toward the parking lot where my van was blocked in, but toward the river path Richard had pointed out earlier. Behind me, I heard shouts and the beams of flashlights cutting through the darkness, but the path quickly descended into dense woods that offered concealment. The sounds from the furnace building continued, growing in intensity, and were joined by other noises. Voices calling in French, the clang of tools, sounds of industrial activity where no activity should be possible. I ran until my lungs burned, following the path along the St. Maurice River, checking occasionally to ensure my camera was still recording. The rational part of my brain insisted this supernatural distraction had been a convenient malfunction or even a deliberate diversion created by the looters to cover their activities. But another part, the part that had interviewed hundreds of people with ghost stories, wondered if the forges really were haunted, the spirits perhaps disturbed by the removal of artifacts tied to their eternal labors. I pushed the thought aside, focusing on immediate concerns. I was alone in unfamiliar woods at night, pursued by people with a vested interest in obtaining my recordings, with a phone battery now reduced to 8%. The path eventually joined a wider trail, and in the distance, I could see lights, a road, perhaps, or houses where I might find help. As I hurried towards civilization, my chest camera captured a flicker of movement to my right. A woman in period dress, pale and translucent in the moonlight, regarding me with solemn eyes before dissolving into the darkness between the trees. I reached a small cluster of houses on the outskirts of Trois-Rivières around midnight, my professional skepticism severely tested by what my camera had recorded along the river path. 3 separate apparitions: the woman in period dress, a child carrying what appeared to be a bucket of iron ore, and most disturbingly, a man with severe burns covering half his face, his 18th century clothing suggesting a forge accident victim. Each had appeared briefly, visible in my camera footage, though occasionally I'd seen nothing with my naked eye until reviewing the recording. I finally found a 24-hour convenience store where the clerk, noting my disheveled appearance and American accent, allowed me to charge my phone and call a taxi. I considered calling the police, but hesitated. Would they believe my story about historical society members looting archaeological artifacts, especially when those members likely included respected local figures? The taxi dropped me at a budget motel far from the forges, where I checked in under my middle name, paying cash from my emergency fund. In my room, I immediately downloaded all my footage to my laptop, backing it up to both my external drive and cloud storage. The chest camera had captured everything: the looters in the forge, my confrontation with Cassandra, and my escape along the river. It had also captured the apparitions, which even on review defied rational explanation. Most crucially, it had recorded Cassandra identifying herself and essentially admitting to unauthorized excavation. As I reviewed the footage, a notification appeared on my phone, an email from Richard Tremblay, sent to my public creator address, expressing concern that I had wandered off during our arranged filming and requesting I contact him immediately to ensure your safety. Sleep was impossible despite my exhaustion. Instead, I researched the Trois-Rivières Historical Society, discovering that Cassandra LeBlanc was indeed its director and that Richard served on its board. The society operated a small private museum separate from the provincial-run Forges site, featuring rare artifacts from local history. More disturbing were the news articles I found about break-ins at similar historical sites across Quebec. Nothing stolen, but reports of disturbances that the site's directors generally attributed to vandals or trespassers. In each case, ghost stories had subsequently emerged, increasing tourism but also drawing attention away from the site's archaeological significance. It was a clever system. Use paranormal tales to boost visitor revenue, while simultaneously creating cover for their nighttime excavations, with any witnesses dismissed as thrill seekers chasing spirits. Morning brought a decision: confront the Historical Society with my evidence, go directly to the provincial authorities, or do what any good content creator would do: break the story myself. I chose a hybrid approach, first uploading an edited version of my footage to a private server with instructions for it to be published automatically if I didn't enter a passcode every 24 hours. Then I messaged Richard, agreeing to meet him at a public cafe in downtown Trois-Rivières to discuss what happened. My van was still at the Forges parking lot, and I needed to retrieve it without walking into an ambush. The cafe I chose was bustling with morning customers, witnesses everywhere, with security cameras and multiple exits. Richard arrived looking haggard, the silver-haired docent persona replaced by a nervousness that manifested in constantly checking the door. "Where is your camera equipment?" were his first words, not even bothering with pleasantries. I smiled, channeling every true crime podcast I'd ever consumed. "Somewhere safe," I replied, along with multiple copies of everything I recorded last night. Richard's facade cracked completely at my words. "You don't understand what you've stumbled into," he said, voice low despite the ambient noise of the cafe. "This isn't about petty looting or selling artifacts. It's about preserving history that would otherwise be lost. He explained their perspective. Government funding for proper archaeological work at the forges covered only a fraction of the site. Development pressures and climate change threatened unexcavated areas. The Historical Society had taken matters into their own hands, conducting careful nighttime excavations, properly documenting finds, and preserving artifacts in their private museum. Illegal? Technically. Wrong? I don't believe so, Richard insisted. And the ghost stories? I pressed. He had the decency to look embarrassed. A necessary distraction. Most of our unusual nocturnal activities get attributed to paranormal phenomena. It's convenient. And what about last night? I asked. The sounds from the furnace building? The apparitions by the river? Richard's expression shifted from earnest to confused. What apparitions? We created some noise using pre-recorded industrial sounds played through hidden speakers to distract you, but nothing visual. He seemed genuinely perplexed by my description of the figures I'd seen. I pulled out my laptop, turning it so he could view the footage from my escape along the river path. As the pale woman in period dress appeared on screen, Richard's face drained of color. "That's impossible," he whispered. "That's Marie-Anne Poulin. She died in 1784. He stared at me. "We have her portrait in our museum. She was the wife of the forge master who reportedly continued to watch for his return every night after he was lost in a river accident." The blood rushed from my face as I realized the implication. Either Richard was continuing an elaborate deception, or my skepticism had crumbled in the face of genuine paranormal activity. Our standoff ended with an unexpected compromise. The Historical Society would return my van and equipment undamaged. I would be granted exclusive access to document their proper archaeological processes, their careful excavation methods, their documentation systems, their preservation techniques, to demonstrate they weren't simply looting but conducting unauthorized preservation. In return, I would blur their faces in any footage I released, focus on the artifacts rather than the people recovering them, and help them build a case for increased official funding by showcasing the site's historical importance. "And the ghosts?" I asked. Richard shrugged, still visibly shaken by the footage I'd shown him. "Report what you experienced. We've never faked apparitions, only sounds and the occasional moved object to support the existing legends." Back at my van that afternoon, I found everything exactly as I'd left it, including the small cameras I'd hidden around the site, now containing hours of footage showing nothing but empty historic buildings, with occasional orbs of light that could easily be dust particles or insects. None of the dramatic apparitions I'd encountered on my escape appeared on these stationary cameras. As I prepared to leave Trois-Rivières, Cassandra approached, her museum curator demeanor firmly back in place. "Richard says you saw Marie-Anne," she said without preamble. When I nodded, she handed me a small iron key, clearly hand-forged centuries ago. "This was found near the Grande Maison last month. We believe it belonged to her living quarters." The key was heavy in my palm, its surface rough with age. "Some say she's not looking for her husband," Cassandra continued. "She's looking for this key, which she was carrying when she allegedly jumped into the river after receiving news of his death." She fixed me with an evaluating gaze. "Perhaps you should return it to her." Ghost to ghost. As I drove away from the forges, the key secure in my glove compartment, I reviewed my professional options. Continue debunking ghost stories I now partially believed in. Pivot to exposing archaeological preservation vigilantes, or somehow merge these narratives into something entirely new. While I deliberated, the iron key occasionally rattled against my dashboard without explanation, and my van's radio periodically captured snatches of what sounded like 18th century French work songs, despite being turned completely off.